They total 23 in all, these images. Each is only 28 inches in diameter, but taken together, they represent the enormity of tradition and a colossal responsibility. Ringing the gallery of the U.S. House of Representatives, the hallowed meeting space so brutally desecrated by the violent mobs that overran the U.S. Capitol on Wednesday, terrorizing all of those inside. Ringing this gallery above the entrances are displayed the images of 23 lawgivers from throughout human history. Some come from ancient times. Hammurabi, king of Babylonia nearly 4,000 years ago, created the earliest surviving law code. Lycurgus is credited with writing the laws of ancient Sparta. Byzantium is represented. So are the great leaders of early Christendom like Justinian I and medieval Islam, including Suleiman the Magnificent. Napoleon is there. So is King Edward I, the founder of England's parliamentary system. Each of them was chosen for establishing principles that underlie American law. Sculpted in relief in white Vermont marble, 22 of the images are shown in profile. The 11 in the eastern half of the House chamber face left, the 11 in the western half face right. All of them look toward the one portrait that is in full face, that of Moses, who holds the place of greatest prominence in the center of the north wall. Astonishing, isn't it? Of all these great lawgivers who established rules by which human beings live together, the one given the greatest prominence is the one known by legend alone. And yet this legend, which begins tonight in the Torah portion, Shemot, at the beginning of the book of Exodus, this legend teaches us far more than just fine points of law. Moses' story is one of great leadership at a time of suffering, compassion in a world that is unkind, and humility where one might have expected pride. Moses, although born an Israelite, was raised in the palace of the Pharaoh in Egypt. He had every reason to preen, to strut, to scorn the masses. And yet the Moses that we meet in these early chapters is surprisingly compassionate. Now, we don't know whether he was aware of his true heritage when he was growing up, but when we meet him as a young man, he is overcome with anger seeing an Egyptian overlord viciously beating a Hebrew slave, so much so that he kills the Egyptian and buries the body. In exile in the land of Midian, he comes to the rescue of a group of women being harassed by shepherds as they try to water their flocks at a well. And he is rewarded by marrying one of them, Zipporah, with whom he will have 2 sons. Years later, as the oppression of the Hebrews in Egypt is becoming too great for them to bear, the Israelite God speaks to Moses out of a lowly bush. You shall go and free my people from Egypt, God tells Moses, who responds with great humility, asking, who am I that I should go to Pharaoh? He asks for and receives one assurance after another that the people will believe him and that they will follow him, and that God will ensure that he is successful. Now, in the later chapters of the book of Exodus, we will see this Moses, the lawgiver, who's depicted in that relief in the house chamber. The charismatic leader raising his staff over the sea of reeds to part the waters for the people. The beloved of God, whose face shines with divine light as he descends Mount Sinai with the 10 commandments, the fundamental rules that will underlie Jewish law and Jewish life forever, and serve as a guide for non-Jewish life around the world as well. But tonight, shaken as we are by this violent insurrection that sought to destroy the foundations of our nation, we take hope and inspiration from this young Moses. The Moses whose first reaction was always to help others regardless of the danger to himself. The Moses whose tender care of the flocks assured God that he would be a good caretaker of the people. The Moses who spoke up for those who were persecuted and suffering. Moses, the lawgiver, could not have existed without Moses, the servant of God, Moses, the compassionate leader, Moses, the fearless advocate. It is this Moses who looked down upon the horror of Wednesday's violence in that House chamber, when a mob agitated by months of false allegations and wild conspiracy theories was then turned loose on the streets of Washington, D.C., overrunning the surprisingly unprepared Capitol Police, smashing windows and doors, trashing offices, stealing valuables, and then smiling for the camera as they so proudly strutted among their destruction. We have not seen anything like this in our lifetime, and I hope to God we never will see it again. I pray that those who initiated and perpetuated these lies will be humbled and chastened by what they have wrought. I hope that all Americans now understand the fragility of our American experiment in democracy and the responsibility that each and every one of us has for its continued success. That, too, is something that we learned from this young Moses. He knows that God's law means nothing unless each Israelite has an equal stake in it. He calls upon the leaders of each and every tribe to help bring justice and fairness to bear in the homes and the streets of this young nation. He calls on each person to look after the interests of the other, whether citizen or sojourner. He publicly stands up to bullies, even those within his extended family. He publicly calls out those who seek power for the sake of their own gratification. He condemns idolatry in all its ugly forms, whether it is worshiping molten idols or the gold from which they have made. So we understand why Moses is depicted as the primary lawgiver in the U.S. House chamber and why all others are turned to look to him. Our Torah remains the most influential of all of these codes of law throughout history. It is the foundation not only of Jewish life, but of Christian and Islamic life as well. It was unique in the ancient world for its universality, its equal treatment of all, regardless of status or heritage. No one is exempt from its rules. And so it is that Attorney General nominee Judge Merrick Garland stated this week the basic principles on which the Justice Department will operate under his leadership. The essence of the rule of law, he said, is that like cases are treated alike, that there not be one rule for Democrats and another for Republicans, one rule for friends and another for foes, one rule for the powerful and another for the powerless. These principles, he said, ensuring the rule of law and making the promise of equal justice under law real, are the great principles upon which the Department of Justice was founded and for which it must always stand. These principles stem directly from Torah. Its ethical imperatives are both universal and timeless. They have stood strong against tyrants and bullies, anarchists and nihilists, bigots, and even those bent on genocide. We rely on Torah and tradition now, knowing that it is our responsibility, each and every one of us, to keep its eternal flame alive. So tonight, shaken as we are by this violent insurrection that sought to destroy the foundations of our nation, we take hope and inspiration from this young Moses, and we accept the responsibility of the Torah that he shared with us from God. There is a story told of the great sage Rabbi Zusha, a tzaddik, a truly great and holy man who lived in the Ukraine in the 18th century. It's short and simple. Before his death, Rabbi Zusha said, "In the coming world, they will not ask me, 'Why were you not Moses?' They will ask me, 'Why were you not Zusha?'" None of us is expected to be Moses. Each of us is expected to be all that we can be. Each of us must reflect and live the moral imperative that Moses taught us, not only from Mount Sinai, but through the way he lived his life every day. We too must call out bullies and their enablers. We too must stand up for the downtrodden and the dispossessed. We too must raise up the lowly and bring down the haughty. We too must demand a system of tzedek umishpat, of fairness in justice. We too must hold the powerful and the privileged accountable for what they say and do or fail to do. And not just we as Jews, but we as Americans. Our Torah, brought to us by Moses the lawgiver, was the single most influential code of law in the founding of this nation. It provided great inspiration to Thomas Jefferson, one of those whose likeness also is turned to Moses in the U.S. House chamber. But like the documents written by our nation's founders, Torah dies if we treat it as ancient history, mere words in a scroll from a long ago world. Like the Declaration of Independence and the US Constitution, Torah must live, and only we can breathe life into it day after day, mitzvah by mitzvah, struggle by struggle, victory by victory. God forbid that when our time on earth comes to an end, it can be asked of us, why weren't you the best that you could be? And God grant that the time we do have on earth, however long or short it may be, is inspired by this great eternal flame of faith and hope and God's love. Ken Yehi Ratzon, be this God's will and our mission, as we say together, Amen.